The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as Captain James Morrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be one of the most important days of his 20-year career as a royal guard. Today was supposed to mark the first anniversary memorial service for Queen Elizabeth II, a woman he had served faithfully and whom he respected more than anyone else in the world. James had been hand-picked by the late Queen herself to oversee the security arrangements for all major royal events. His dedication was legendary among the palace staff, and his attention to detail had earned him the Queen's personal trust during her final years. The memorial service had been planned for months, with every aspect carefully coordinated between multiple royal households, government officials, and international dignitaries. The guest list read like a who's who of world leaders. Presidents, prime ministers, and royal family members from across Europe had confirmed their attendance. The Archbishop of Canterbury had prepared a special sermon, and the Queen's favorite hymns had been selected for the service. Even the flowers had been chosen to reflect her personal preferences: white roses and lily of the valley, the same blooms that had adorned her wedding bouquet decades earlier. James walked through the chapel one final time, checking every security detail. The metal detectors were functioning perfectly. His team was positioned strategically throughout the grounds, and the backup protocols were all in place. He had personally reviewed the seating arrangements 3 times, ensuring that each dignitary would be properly protected while maintaining the solemnity appropriate for such an occasion. His phone buzzed at exactly 9:30 in the morning. The caller ID showed it was coming from Clarence House, the official residence of the King and Queen consort. James answered immediately, expecting a routine confirmation or perhaps a minor adjustment to the timeline. "Captain Morrison, this is Lady Sarah from Queen Camilla's private office," the voice on the other end said, sounding unusually strained. "I'm calling to inform you that Her Majesty has decided to cancel today's memorial service." James felt the blood drain from his face. He was certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Did you say postpone?" "No, Captain, cancel. The service will not be taking place today, and Queen Camilla has asked that all guests be notified immediately." The phone felt heavy in James's hand. He looked around the perfectly prepared chapel, thinking of the hundreds of people who were probably already traveling to Windsor. "May I ask why? Has there been a security threat? A family emergency?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Queen Camilla feels that the timing is not appropriate for such a large gathering. She believes it would be better to have a smaller, more private commemoration at a later date." James's jaw clenched involuntarily. The timing was not appropriate? This was the exact date that had been chosen specifically because it marked 1 year since the Queen's passing. Every detail had been coordinated months in advance. World leaders had rearranged their schedules. The British public had been looking forward to this moment of national remembrance. "Lady Sarah, with all due respect, we have confirmation from heads of state across 3 continents. The Prime Minister of Canada landed at Heathrow 2 hours ago specifically for this service. How exactly are we supposed to notify everyone with just hours of notice? I understand your concerns, Captain, but the decision has been made. Queen Camilla's office will handle the official notifications to heads of state and government officials. You are to dismiss your security detail and stand down all arrangements." James ended the call and immediately tried reaching King Charles's private secretary. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He tried again, then attempted to reach other members of the royal household staff. Each call either went unanswered or was met with the same message. The memorial service had been cancelled by order of Queen Camilla. Standing alone in the chapel, where he had expected to honor his beloved late Queen, James felt a rage building inside him, unlike anything he had experienced in his professional career. This was not just a cancelled event. This was a betrayal of everything the Queen had stood for, and a slap in the face to everyone who had loved and respected her. He thought about the countless hours the Queen had spent planning her own funeral and memorial arrangements during her final months. She had been meticulous about every detail, wanting to ensure that her passing would be marked with the dignity and respect appropriate for someone who had devoted her entire life to serving the British people. She had specifically requested that the first anniversary be commemorated with a service that would bring together leaders from around the world in a show of unity and remembrance. James walked to the front of the chapel and stood where the Queen's portrait was supposed to be displayed during the service. The easel stood empty, waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. He could almost hear her voice, the way she used to speak to him during their private security briefings. She had always been gracious but firm, understanding but decisive. She would have been appalled by this last-minute cancellation. His radio crackled to life as members of his security team began checking in, confused by rumors they were hearing from palace staff. James realized he would have to be the one to tell his dedicated team that their months of preparation had been for nothing. These were men and women who had served the Queen with the same devotion he had, and now they were being told that her memorial was not important enough to proceed as planned. The morning that had started with such promise and purpose had transformed into something that felt like a nightmare. James looked around the empty chapel one more time, knowing that this moment would be burned into his memory forever. This was the day that Queen Camilla had chosen to cancel the memorial service for one of the most beloved monarchs in British history, and he was the one who would have to live with the consequences of her decision. As he prepared to make the most difficult announcement of his career, James Morrison knew that his relationship with the royal family would never be the same again. The news spread through Windsor Castle like wildfire. Within 30 minutes of James receiving the call, palace staff members were huddled in small groups, whispering among themselves with looks of complete disbelief. Many of these employees had worked for the royal family for decades, and they had never witnessed anything quite like this before. Margaret Thompson, the head housekeeper who had served the Queen for 35 years, was the first to approach James directly. Her face was flushed with anger, and her hands were trembling as she spoke. "Captain Morrison, please tell me this is some kind of terrible mistake. Please tell me that woman has not actually canceled our Queen's memorial service." James had never heard Margaret refer to Queen Camilla as that woman before, but he could understand her emotions. Margaret had been personally responsible for maintaining the Queen's private apartments and had developed a close relationship with her over the years. The Queen had often praised Margaret's dedication and had even invited her to small private gatherings during the Christmas holidays. "I'm afraid it's true, Margaret. I received the call directly from Clarence House about an hour ago." Margaret's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. "But the flowers have already been arranged. The choir has been practicing for weeks. I personally oversaw the preparation of the reception room where the Queen always liked to meet with special guests after formal events." James nodded grimly. He had seen the beautiful floral arrangements that morning, each one carefully crafted to honor the Queen's memory. The white roses were perfect, and the lily of the valley had been flown in specially from the Queen's gardens at Balmoral. Now all of that work would go to waste. Other staff members began gathering around them. Thomas Bradley, who had been the Queen's personal valet during her final years, looked as though he might cry. "She promised us," he said quietly. "When the Queen passed, Queen Camilla promised us that her memory would be honored appropriately. She said the anniversary would be a day of celebration for everything our Queen had accomplished." James remembered that conversation as well. It had taken place just 3 days after the Queen's funeral, when emotions were still raw and everyone was struggling to adjust to the massive changes ahead. Queen Camilla had seemed genuinely moved by the staff's grief and had made what appeared to be heartfelt commitments about preserving the Queen's legacy. "What reason did they give?" asked Patricia Williams, who had managed the Queen's correspondence for over 20 years. Patricia had been working overtime for the past month, coordinating with dignitaries around the world and ensuring that every detail of their visit would be perfect. James hesitated. He did not want to upset the staff further, but they deserved to know the truth. They said Queen Camilla felt the timing was not appropriate for such a large gathering. She wants a smaller, more private commemoration instead. The silence that followed was deafening. These staff members had witnessed the Queen handle some of the most difficult moments in modern British history, with grace and wisdom. They had seen her navigate family scandals, national tragedies, and political upheavals, while always maintaining her dignity and sense of duty. The idea that a memorial service in her honor could be cancelled so casually was incomprehensible to them. "Private for whom?" Margaret finally asked, her voice rising. "Private for the woman who couldn't be bothered to show proper respect to the Queen while she was alive?" James knew that Margaret was referring to the well-documented tensions between Queen Elizabeth and Camilla during the years before the Queen's death. While the relationship had improved significantly over time, there had always been an underlying strain that palace insiders were aware of, but never discussed publicly. Thomas shook his head in disgust. Do you know what the Queen told me just 2 weeks before she died? She said she wanted her first anniversary to be a day when people from all over the world could come together to remember not just her, but what the monarchy could represent at its best. She wanted it to be about unity and service. And now what do we have instead? Patricia added bitterly. We have chaos, disappointment, and embarrassment on an international scale. World leaders are probably landing at British airports right now, expecting to attend a memorial service that no longer exists. James's radio began buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from his security team. The first international guests were indeed beginning to arrive, and there was confusion at every level about what exactly was happening. Some airport security officials had heard rumors about a cancellation, but they had not received any official confirmation and did not know whether to redirect the arriving dignitaries. Captain Morrison, came a voice through the radio. We have the German Chancellor's advance team asking for confirmation of the security protocols. They're saying they've heard conflicting reports about today's schedule. James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was going to have to start making official announcements soon, and he knew that each conversation would be more difficult than the last. These were people who had made extraordinary efforts to honor the Queen's memory, and now he had to tell them that their efforts had been wasted. Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. Captain, I want you to know that none of us blame you for this disaster. We all know how much you loved and respected our Queen, but I hope you also know that this is not something any of us will ever forget or forgive. The weight of her words settled heavily on James's shoulders. He realized that this cancelled memorial service would become a defining moment, not just for his own career, but for how history would remember Queen Camilla's early reign. The decision to cancel would be seen by many as a sign of disrespect toward the late Queen and a betrayal of the promises that had been made to honor her legacy. As he prepared to begin the heartbreaking process of notifying international dignitaries that their journey had been in vain, James wondered if Queen Camilla truly understood the magnitude of what she had just done. This was not simply a cancelled event. It was a moment that would damage relationships, break trust, and raise serious questions about her judgment and priorities. The palace staff dispersed slowly, each returning to their duties with heavy hearts and growing resentment. James stood alone once again, knowing that the next few hours would be among the most challenging of his entire career. By noon, James Morrison was dealing with what could only be described as a diplomatic nightmare. His phone had not stopped ringing for over 2 hours, and each conversation was more difficult than the last. The first call had come from the French President's security detail, who were already at Heathrow Airport and demanding to know why they had not received any official notification about the cancelled service. Captain Morrison, we have been in contact with your office for 3 months about today's arrangements, the French security chief said, his voice tight with controlled anger. My president cleared his entire schedule for this event. He postponed a critical meeting with EU leaders specifically to attend this memorial service. Are you telling me that all of our preparation was for nothing? James felt sick to his stomach as he tried to explain the situation. Sir, I understand your frustration completely. I only learned about the cancellation myself this morning, and I had no advance warning that this decision was being considered. This is completely unacceptable from a diplomatic standpoint, the French official continued. When heads of state make commitments like this, there are protocols that must be followed. Cancellations require weeks of advance notice, not hours. This kind of behavior damages relationships between our countries. Similar conversations followed with security teams representing Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several European nations. Each call was more painful than the last, as James realized that the damage from this decision would extend far beyond hurt feelings. International relationships that had taken decades to build were being strained by Queen Camilla's impulsive choice. The call from the Canadian Prime Minister's office was particularly difficult. Captain Morrison, our Prime Minister, has spoken about Queen Elizabeth with tremendous affection throughout his entire career, the Chief of Staff explained. He saw her as a grandmother figure and was deeply honored to be invited to this memorial service. He's already given a statement to the Canadian press about how much this day means to him personally. James could hear the pain in the man's voice. The Canadian Prime Minister had indeed been one of Queen Elizabeth's favorite Commonwealth leaders, and she had often spoken warmly about their conversations during state visits. The idea that he would be turned away at the last minute was heartbreaking. "I wish I could offer you a better explanation," James said honestly. "All I can tell you is that Queen Camilla made this decision this morning, and none of us were given any advance warning. Captain, I have to ask, is the king aware of what his wife has done? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like Queen Camilla acting unilaterally to cancel an event that was meant to honor his mother." That question had been weighing heavily on James's mind all morning. He had still not been able to reach King Charles or any of his senior staff members. Every call to the king's private office went straight to voicemail, and James was beginning to suspect that Charles might not even know what had happened yet. His suspicions were confirmed when his radio crackled with an urgent message from the main palace security desk. "Captain Morrison, we have King Charles's motorcade approaching the castle. He appears to be arriving for the memorial service and does not seem to be aware of any cancellation." James felt his heart sink even further. If the king was arriving expecting to attend his mother's memorial service, it meant that Queen Camilla had made this decision without consulting her husband. The implications of that realization were staggering. He immediately headed toward the main entrance to intercept the king before he could enter the chapel and discover the canceled arrangements. As he walked quickly through the corridors, James passed the reception room where a magnificent buffet had been prepared for the post-service gathering. Palace chefs had worked for days preparing traditional British dishes that had been favorites of the late queen, including her beloved cucumber sandwiches and Earl Grey tea. The sight of the untouched food made James even angrier. Dozens of staff members had poured their hearts into every detail of this day, and all of their efforts were being wasted because of one person's selfish decision. King Charles's car pulled up to the main entrance just as James reached the courtyard. The king stepped out looking dignified and solemn, clearly prepared for an emotional but meaningful day of remembrance for his mother. He was wearing the ceremonial uniform that he always chose for the most important royal occasions, and James could see that he had pinned his mother's favorite brooch to his jacket as a personal tribute. "Good afternoon, Captain Morrison," the king said warmly as he approached. "I trust everything is ready for today's service. I know how much work you and your team have put into making this day perfect." James felt as though his heart was breaking, as he realized he would have to be the one to deliver this devastating news to the king. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid I have some very difficult information to share with you." The king's expression immediately changed from warmth to concern. "What's wrong, Captain? Has there been a security threat?" "Sir, I received a call this morning from Queen Camilla's office informing me that the memorial service has been cancelled. I was told that Her Majesty felt the timing was not appropriate for such a large gathering." King Charles stood completely still for what felt like an eternity. His face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then a cold anger that James had never seen from him before. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made James understand exactly how furious the king was. "Captain Morrison, are you telling me that my wife canceled my mother's memorial service without consulting me?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I believe that is exactly what happened." The king closed his eyes and took several deep breaths, clearly trying to maintain his composure. When he opened them again, James could see a determination that reminded him strongly of the late queen during her most challenging moments. "Captain, I want you to know that this decision does not reflect my wishes or my feelings about my mother's legacy. I am as shocked and disappointed as you are." "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your words mean more to me than you know." King Charles looked toward the chapel where his mother's memorial service should have been taking place. "Captain Morrison, I think it's time I had a very serious conversation with my wife about respect, duty, and the responsibilities that come with wearing the crown." As the king walked toward the castle with purposeful strides, James realized that this canceled memorial service had created a crisis that went far beyond diplomatic embarrassment. It had created a rift within the royal family itself, and the consequences of Queen Camilla's decision were only beginning to unfold. The confrontation between King Charles and Queen Camilla took place in the private study that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth. James Morrison could hear raised voices echoing through the corridors of Windsor Castle, something that was virtually unheard of in the normally controlled environment of the royal residence. Palace staff members found excuses to walk past the study, trying to catch fragments of what was clearly becoming a heated argument. "How could you make such a decision without consulting me?" King Charles's voice carried through the heavy oak doors. "This was my mother's memorial service, Camilla." "My mother." Queen Camilla's response was quieter, but James could still make out her defensive tone. "Charles, I thought it would be better to have something more intimate. All of those world leaders and media attention. It felt like a circus, not a proper remembrance." "A circus?" The king's voice rose significantly. "Those world leaders were my mother's friends and colleagues. They respected her deeply and wanted to honor her memory. The President of France knew my mother for over 20 years. The Canadian Prime Minister called her his inspiration. And you decided they weren't worthy of attending her memorial." James had never heard King Charles speak with such raw emotion. Throughout his life, the king had been known for his measured responses and diplomatic language, but the cancellation of his mother's memorial service had clearly pushed him beyond his usual restraint. Margaret Thompson approached James cautiously, her face still showing the shock and anger that had been building all day. "Captain, the international guests who were already en route are asking what they should do. Several of them want to pay their respects privately, even though the official service has been cancelled." James nodded thoughtfully. "Margaret, I think we should accommodate any dignitary who wants to visit the chapel privately. It's the least we can do after this embarrassment. I've already prepared the Queen's favorite flowers in small arrangements that could be placed throughout the chapel," Margaret said. "Even if we can't have the official service, we can still create a space where people can come to remember her properly." The argument in the study continued, with Queen Camilla's voice becoming more defensive. "I didn't think it through completely, Charles. I just felt overwhelmed by all the arrangements and the pressure. I thought a smaller gathering would be more meaningful." "Overwhelmed?" King Charles's response was sharp. "Camilla, being queen consort means being overwhelmed sometimes. It means putting duty before personal comfort. It means honoring commitments even when they're difficult. My mother understood that better than anyone." James felt a strange sense of validation, hearing the king defend the principles that Queen Elizabeth had embodied throughout her reign. The late queen had often spoken to him about the importance of duty and service, even when it required personal sacrifice. She would have been appalled by the idea of canceling such an important event simply because it felt overwhelming. Patricia Williams appeared at James's side, carrying a thick folder of correspondence. "Captain Morrison, I've been going through the responses we received from international dignitaries about today's service. Would you like to know what some of them wrote?" James nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear more evidence of what had been lost. Patricia opened the folder and began reading. The President of Ireland wrote, "Queen Elizabeth was a beacon of stability and grace throughout my entire political career. It will be an honor to stand with the British people as we remember her extraordinary legacy." The Prime Minister of New Zealand said, "Her Majesty showed our small nation such kindness and respect that attending her memorial service feels like a personal obligation." Each quote made James feel worse about the situation. These were not just diplomatic pleasantries. They were genuine expressions of love and respect for Queen Elizabeth from leaders around the world. All of those heartfelt sentiments had been dismissed by Queen Camilla's impulsive decision. The voices from the study grew louder again, and this time, Queen Camilla sounded close to tears. "I know I made a mistake, Charles. I know I should have talked to you first, but I can't change what I've done now." "You're right, you can't change it," King Charles replied, his voice cold with disappointment. "But what you can do is learn from this terrible error in judgment. Being queen consort is not about your personal comfort or preferences. It's about serving something larger than yourself." James found himself thinking about all the conversations he had shared with Queen Elizabeth about leadership and responsibility. She had often told him that the hardest part of being queen was not the ceremonial duties or the public appearances. It was the constant awareness that every decision affected other people's lives. She had carried that weight gracefully for over 70 years, and she would have expected the same level of thoughtfulness from her successor. Thomas Bradley joined the growing group of staff members who were gathered near James, all of them trying to process what had happened. "Captain, I keep thinking about what the Queen would say if she could see what's happening today. She always told us that the monarchy's strength came from keeping promises and honoring commitments. She also used to say that trust takes decades to build and only moments to destroy. Margaret added sadly, I'm afraid that's exactly what's happened today. The argument in the study seemed to be winding down, but James could still hear King Charles speaking firmly to his wife. Camilla, I need you to understand that this decision will have consequences far beyond today. People will remember this, and they will judge both of us based on how we handled my mother's memory. What do you want me to do, Charles? Should I call everyone and apologize? I want you to think very carefully about what kind of queen consort you want to be remembered as. Do you want to be someone who honored my mother's legacy, or someone who diminished it? The study fell silent, and James realized that the conversation was probably over. He also realized that this incident had fundamentally changed the dynamic within the royal family. King Charles would never again trust Queen Camilla to make important decisions without his input, and the palace staff would always remember this day as the moment when Queen Camilla showed her true priorities. As the afternoon wore on, several international dignitaries did indeed arrive at Windsor Castle to pay their private respects. Margaret had done a beautiful job creating intimate memorial displays throughout the chapel, and James was moved to see world leaders taking quiet moments to honor Queen Elizabeth's memory despite the chaos surrounding the cancelled service. The day that was supposed to be a celebration of Queen Elizabeth's life had instead become a painful reminder of how quickly things could go wrong when duty was abandoned in favor of personal preference. James knew that this story would become part of royal history, and he suspected it would not be remembered kindly. The news of the cancelled memorial service reached the British public by early afternoon, and the reaction was swift and devastating for Queen Camilla's reputation. Social media exploded with outrage. Newspaper websites crashed from the volume of traffic, and television news programs abandoned their regular programming to cover what was being called the biggest royal scandal in decades. James Morrison watched the coverage from his office in Windsor Castle, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness as he saw the public's reaction mirror his own feelings about the situation. The hashtag Respect the Queen began trending worldwide within hours, with millions of people expressing their shock and disappointment at the cancelled service. Captain Morrison, his assistant, called from the doorway. We're getting calls from major news organizations around the world. They're all asking for official statements about what happened today. James shook his head firmly. All media inquiries need to go through the official palace press office. We don't comment on internal royal family decisions. But privately, James was following every news report and social media post about the cancellation. The public reaction was overwhelmingly negative toward Queen Camilla, with many people questioning whether she was fit to serve as queen consort if she could show such disrespect to the late queen's memory. One particularly powerful social media post came from a veteran who had served in the Queen's Guard during the 1980s. I spent 3 years of my life protecting Queen Elizabeth, he wrote. She was the most dedicated, selfless person I ever met. The fact that her memorial service was cancelled at the last minute by someone who never understood what service really means is heartbreaking. The Queen deserved better. Television news programs were interviewing royal historians and constitutional experts, all of whom were struggling to find precedent for such a dramatic cancellation. Professor Sarah Williams from Oxford University appeared on BBC News and spoke with barely contained anger about the situation. In over a century of modern royal history, I cannot find a single example of a memorial service for a deceased monarch being cancelled at such short notice, she said. This decision shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what the monarchy represents and what duty means to the British people. The most damaging coverage came from international news outlets, which were focusing on the diplomatic embarrassment caused by the cancellation. CNN ran a segment titled Royal Disaster: How Queen Camilla Damaged Britain's International Relationships in a Single Morning. The report included interviews with several diplomatic experts who explained how difficult it would be to repair the damage caused by treating world leaders so disrespectfully. James received a call from his counterpart in the Canadian Security Services, who had worked with him on previous royal visits. James, I have to tell you that this cancellation has caused serious problems for us politically. Our Prime Minister made a major public statement about attending this service, and now the opposition parties are using this as an example of how the current government doesn't understand protocol and international relations. I'm sorry, Michael. I know this puts you in an impossible position. It's not your fault, mate. But I hope someone in that castle understands that this kind of thing has real consequences beyond hurt feelings. Trust is everything in international relations. And Queen Camilla just told the world that British commitments can't be relied upon. Similar calls came from security officials in Australia, New Zealand, and several European countries. Each conversation made it clearer that the damage from the cancelled memorial service would last far beyond the immediate embarrassment. The evening news programs were even more critical. The lead story on ITV News included a montage of Queen Elizabeth's most memorable moments, followed by harsh criticism of the decision to cancel her memorial service. Queen Elizabeth spent 70 years showing the world what duty and service look like, the anchor said. Today, Queen Camilla showed us the opposite. Social media was filled with comparisons between Queen Elizabeth's lifetime of service and Queen Camilla's single decision to cancel the memorial. Thousands of people shared their personal memories of meeting the late Queen, many emphasizing how she had never canceled or postponed any commitment, no matter how challenging the circumstances. One particularly moving post came from a former palace gardener who had worked at Windsor Castle for 40 years. The Queen never missed a single event in all the time I worked for her, he wrote. Rain or shine, personal illness or family crisis, she always kept her promises to the people. Queen Camilla couldn't even keep a promise to honor the Queen's memory. It breaks my heart. James found himself thinking about all the times he had seen Queen Elizabeth push through personal discomfort or fatigue to fulfill her duties. She had attended official functions while dealing with back pain, family scandals, and personal grief. The idea that a memorial service in her honor could be cancelled because Queen Camilla felt overwhelmed was particularly insulting given the late Queen's own example of perseverance. The Palace Press Office released a brief statement late in the afternoon, but it only made the situation worse. Queen Camilla felt that a more intimate gathering would be more appropriate for remembering Queen Elizabeth's life and service. The decision was made with the best intentions. The public reaction to this statement was immediate and furious. People pointed out that there was nothing intimate about canceling an event that hundreds of people had planned to attend. Many questioned what best intentions could possibly justify such disrespectful treatment of international guests and the late Queen's memory. Royal commentator Victoria Peterson appeared on Sky News and delivered what many considered the most devastating critique of the day. This statement makes things worse, not better, she said. It suggests that Queen Camilla thought she knew better than Queen Elizabeth herself about how the Queen should be remembered. The memorial service was planned according to the late Queen's own wishes. For Queen Camilla to override those wishes and then claim it was done with best intentions is almost insulting to our intelligence. As the day wore on, James realized that this cancelled memorial service had become much more than just a single embarrassing incident. It had become a symbol of everything the public feared about Queen Camilla's approach to her royal duties. People were questioning whether she understood the responsibilities that came with her position, whether she respected the traditions and commitments that defined the monarchy, and whether she was worthy of the role she had inherited. The late Queen's motto had been, "Never complain, never explain," reflecting her belief that actions spoke louder than words. Queen Camilla's actions on this day had spoken very clearly indeed, and the message they sent was one that would damage her reputation for years to come. James knew that tomorrow's newspapers would be brutal, and he suspected that this story would continue to dominate headlines for weeks. The cancelled memorial service had created a crisis of confidence in Queen Camilla's judgment, and James doubted whether she would ever fully recover from the damage she had done to herself and to the monarchy on this single devastating day. The next morning brought a media storm unlike anything James Morrison had witnessed in his 20 years of royal service. Every major British newspaper led with scathing headlines about Queen Camilla's decision to cancel the memorial service. The most brutal came from the Daily Telegraph, which ran the headline, "The Queen Who Forgot Her Duty," alongside a photo of Queen Elizabeth at one of her final public appearances. James arrived at Windsor Castle to find the atmosphere among the staff had shifted from shock and anger to something approaching despair. These were people who had devoted their careers to serving the royal family, and many of them were beginning to question whether they could continue working for an institution that seemed to have lost its moral compass. Margaret Thompson approached him with tears in her eyes, holding a copy of the Times. "Captain Morrison, have you seen what they're saying about us? They're questioning whether the entire royal household has lost its sense of purpose." The Times editorial was indeed devastating. "The cancellation of Queen Elizabeth's memorial service represents more than poor judgment," it read. "It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what the monarchy means to the British people and to the Commonwealth. Queen Camilla has damaged relationships that took decades to build, betrayed the trust of world leaders, and shown disrespect to one of the most beloved figures in modern British history. But it was the international coverage that truly revealed the scope of the damage." The New York Times ran a front-page story titled, "British Royal Family in Crisis After Memorial Cancelled." The article included quotes from diplomatic sources in multiple countries, all speaking anonymously about their government's disappointment and confusion over the handling of the situation. This kind of last-minute cancellation is what we expect from unstable regimes, not from one of our closest allies. One European diplomat was quoted as saying, "It raises serious questions about whether the British royal family can be trusted to maintain the standards of protocol and respect that international relations require." James received a call from the palace press office, where staff members were struggling to manage the crisis. "Captain Morrison, we're getting requests for interviews from over 50 news organizations around the world. Everyone wants to know what really happened behind the scenes. We need to coordinate our response carefully." "What is the official line we're supposed to take?" James asked. "Honestly, we're not sure yet. King Charles is meeting with his senior advisors this morning to discuss damage control, but the situation is unprecedented. We've never had to deal with this level of international embarrassment over a single decision." The morning television programs were dominated by discussion of the cancelled memorial service. Former palace staff members were being interviewed about Queen Elizabeth's commitment to duty, with many drawing unfavorable comparisons to Queen Camilla's behavior. One particularly powerful interview featured Lord Thompson, who had served as the Queen's private secretary for 15 years. "Queen Elizabeth once told me that the crown was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a burden to be carried with grace," he said on BBC Breakfast. "She understood that every decision she made reflected on the entire institution of monarchy." Yesterday's cancellation suggests that Queen Camilla either doesn't understand this responsibility or doesn't care about it. The criticism was not limited to traditional media. Social media continued to explode with anger and disappointment, with many people sharing their own stories about Queen Elizabeth's dedication to duty. A particularly viral post came from a nurse who had met the Queen during a hospital visit just months before her death. "The Queen was clearly exhausted and probably should have been resting at home," the nurse wrote, "but she spent 3 hours with patients and staff, asking thoughtful questions and bringing joy to people who really needed it. She never would have canceled a commitment just because she felt overwhelmed." The contrast with Queen Camilla's behavior yesterday is heartbreaking. James found himself reading these posts during his breaks, finding comfort in the fact that so many people shared his feelings about the Queen's exceptional character and commitment to service. The cancelled memorial had reminded everyone of what they had lost when Queen Elizabeth died, and it made Queen Camilla's failure to honor her memory seem even more painful. The palace staff were also sharing their own stories among themselves. Thomas Bradley told James about a conversation he had with the Queen just days before her death. "She was very weak, but she was still worried about making sure everyone would be taken care of after she was gone. She specifically mentioned the importance of maintaining the traditions and ceremonies that meant so much to people around the world. She would have been devastated to see what happened yesterday." Patricia Williams added, "The Queen always said that the monarchy's power came from keeping faith with the people. Queen Camilla broke that faith in the most public way possible. By midday, the situation had become so serious that King Charles was forced to make an unprecedented public statement. Standing in the same room where his mother had delivered some of her most important speeches, he looked tired and deeply troubled as he addressed the nation. "I want to speak directly to the British people and to our friends around the world about yesterday's events," he began. "The decision to cancel my mother's memorial service was made without my knowledge or approval, and it does not reflect my feelings about my mother's legacy or my commitment to the duties she passed on to me. The king's statement was careful not to directly criticize Queen Camilla, but his message was clear. He was distancing himself from her decision and trying to salvage what he could of the monarchy's reputation. It was an extraordinary moment in royal history, a reigning monarch publicly contradicting his consort's actions. My mother devoted her entire life to serving others, King Charles continued. She taught me that duty comes before personal comfort, that promises must be kept even when they're difficult, and that the trust of the people is the most precious thing the monarchy possesses. I pledged to honor these principles throughout my reign. The king's statement helped somewhat, but it also highlighted just how serious the crisis had become. Royal watchers noted that it was extremely rare for a monarch to make such a public statement, distancing himself from his spouse's actions. Some commentators suggested that the royal marriage itself might be under strain as a result of the cancelled memorial. James watched the king's speech with mixed emotions. He was glad to see King Charles defending his mother's memory and reaffirming his commitment to duty, but he was also saddened by the fact that such a statement had been necessary at all. The cancelled memorial service had created divisions within the royal family that might never fully heal. As the day progressed, it became clear that the damage to Queen Camilla's reputation was severe and possibly permanent. Opinion polls showed that her approval rating had dropped dramatically overnight, and many people were calling for her to step back from public duties until she could prove that she understood the responsibilities of her position. The woman who had once hoped to win the British people's acceptance and affection had instead become a symbol of everything they feared about the future of the monarchy. James realized that this single day would define Queen Camilla's reign for years to come, and that the ghost of the cancelled memorial service would haunt her every public appearance.